Good afternoon. Welcome to my lecture, Operation the Mountaineers. This is a study of the forgotten Edwardian opera by Guy Eden and Reginald Somerville on the 115th anniversary of the opera. Just up there. I know most of you personally, so yay, thank you for coming. For those of you who are watching this online, I want to share a bit about myself. My name is Scott Farrell, and I do music here at Tibbetts UMC. In high school, I sang in all of my school's choirs, and I was a theater kid. As an adult, I was in nearly every major performing ensemble in my hometown. I received my musical education at Rock Valley College and Northern Illinois University under Dean Durst, Inger Langsholt, Jack Simon, Michael Beert, and Paul LaPrade. They taught me piano, voice, music theory, composition, and sometimes supported my endeavors in light opera. I did the Mikado in high school as part of my senior year, and after that, I was absolutely attached to doing light opera. So right out of high school, I started my own light opera company and ran it for nearly 20 years. We performed mostly the works of Gilbert and Sullivan and their contemporaries, and a few works of my own. My long-standing interest in Savoy opera has led me to dedicate a number of years to the study of some specific operas, the Mountaineers being one of them. And my company performed that in 2010. You'll see select videos from that production in today's lecture, and also from our 10th anniversary in 2016, and a few others I've picked up along the way, and historic photographs relating to the subject. It is my hope by the end of this lecture, you will have a greater understanding of this work, understand its historical importance, and perhaps agree with me that the Mountaineers deserves better than it has got. I'll tell you how I came to the opera at the close of the lecture. I'll keep things sequential. And that's pretty much it for the introduction. So yay, let's start the story at the very beginning, which is, I'm sure you know. No is a very good place to start. All right, let's get this underway, shall we? In the 1880s, the operas of William S. Gilbert and Sir Arthur Sullivan dominated the London stage and the English-speaking stage with their light operas for modern audiences. But when the run of the Gondoliers concluded in 1890, their hold on theater-goers began to loosen as musical comedy became more popular and more prevalent. Richard D'Oyley Carte, the visionary behind the Gilbert and Sullivan operas since the 1870s, was forced to find new English operas to keep his famous Savoy Theatre open. With Gilbert and Sullivan off pursuing other projects and many of the stars doing likewise, the fortunes of the Savoy started to wane. Some new productions shined better than others. Only a few managed to exceed 200 performances, and a few didn't last 50. Even the latest works from Gilbert and Sullivan struggled to capture the earlier magic, although audiences still loved reviving the classics from the 1880s. By the mid-1890s, the musical comedy had stolen the spotlight, and the Savoy remained committed to its traditional offerings and found it hard to adapt. Efforts to create a blend of opera and musical comedy did not resonate as hoped. Drying out of here, can you tell? Arthur Sullivan died in 1900 and Richard D'Oyley Carte in 1901. Management of the theater passed to his wife Helen, and for the next 2 years, she leased the theater to William Greet. The Savoy continued its tradition of presenting new operas with works written specifically for their performers, and the last new production under the D'Oyley Carte name was A Princess of Kensington by Basil Hood and Edward German. Next slide, please. Is it not coming? All right. After that production ended, the D'Oyley Carte Company broke up, and other entertainments, such as Shakespeare plays, occupied the stage for Savoy for the time. The company was brought back in 1906 with what became known as the first repertory season, and later a second repertory season was given from 1908 to the spring of 1909. Under Helen's management, only the most popular Gilbert and Sullivan operas were presented: HMS Pinafore, The Pirates of Penzance, Patience, Iolanthe, The Mikado, The Yeoman of the Guard, depicted here, and The Gondoliers. But in March 1909, Helen retired as manager of the Savoy Theatre. The season was then finished under management of one of the actors, Charles Herbert Workman, and upon Helen's retirement, he began a year-long stint as manager of the Savoy Theatre. Workman didn't have the necessary business skills or the diplomatic touch that Mrs. D'Oyly-Carte had. He was primarily the principal comedic actor within the company. He was definitely well-liked. When the company toured, audiences enjoyed him across the provinces, and he had a good following at the Savoy. He played the funny man roles in the operas, like the Major General, or the Lord Chancellor, or Jack Point. So it's likely he thought his popularity would help keep the public engaged. I truly think he wanted to maintain the Savoy's legacy, make sure it didn't fade away into nothingness. He took a year to see how things would go. Instead of reviving the classic operas that made the Savoy famous, he chose to roll out entirely new operas, like what was done in the 1890s, when Gilbert and Sullivan were not working together. However, as we'll discover later, his year as a manager turned out to be a flop. Well, Workman got his rented lips. While Workman was getting his feet wet as manager of the Savoy, there was something going on behind the scenes that impacted his efforts. Since 1896, Gilbert had been working on turning one of his old plays into an operatic version. The play in question was The Wicked World, a comedy he wrote in 1873 for the Haymarket Theatre. The story revolves around fairies who invite mortals to their magical realm so that fairies may love as mortals do. But in the end, the mortals have to be sent back to Earth because they brought their not-so-great qualities along, and it tainted fairyland. It was popular in its time, and Gilbert set his sights on transforming it into an opera for the Savoy. Now, over the years, Helen and Sullivan both turned down this idea, mainly because Gilbert insisted that the chorus should consist entirely of women. Other composers also declined, including Sir Edward Elgar. But in 1909, the Welsh composer Edward German was invited to write the music, and he was honored and flattered to be offered to have the chance to work with Gilbert. He accepted it, and work on what would become Fallen Fairies began. By June, Gilbert and German decided to produce the opera at the Savoy. Helen D'Oyly-Carte probably would have nixed the opera as she did in 1897, but since she had retired, Workman had the chance to say yes. To fund the production, Workman gathered a group of financial backers known as the Comic Opera Syndicate, and with Fallen Fairies still being some time away, Workman faced the challenge of filling the empty Savoy Theatre so it wouldn't sit unused. This is where our story on the Mountaineers begins. The concept of this opera began at some unspecified date years earlier. He didn't tell us when. English composer Reginald Somerville, I don't have his picture, was traveling by train through the Rhine one day, and he had been idly glancing at a guidebook when he came across a quaint little tale. It told a local legend of a girl who had two suitors, and unable to decide between them, she asked them to bring back an edelweiss flower from the highest peak of the mountain as a token of love. He realized this was an ideal situation for an opera, but the ending would have to be altered because the story ended tragically. Together with librettist Guy Eden, I don't have his picture either, they created a comic opera that told this story. Eden and Somerville had worked together before on a one-act opera called The Prentice Pillar, which I haven't researched one bit. But they weren't amateurs, this wasn't their first outing. Let's just leave it at that. Somerville met Workman quite casually in the street one day in the summer of 1909, and they got around to discussing the situation at the Savoy. By then, Fallen Fairies was already a done deal, was in progress, and Workman needed something to open the season. Sensing an opportunity, Somerville suggested the Mountaineers, and Workman was at once interested in it. He agreed to start his season of light opera with the Mountaineers until Fallen Fairies was ready. Despite the presence of in-house talent in 1909, many of those who were in the second repertory season operas were not involved with Workman's new venture. Elsie Spain and Jessie Rose were the most prominent of the actors who did stay, but many of the others had either been understudies or they played bit parts both in tours or in London, or they were entirely new to the Savoy. Likely, the famous Savoyards had accepted other performing engagements, and some of them had indeed retired. But another factor could be a lack of faith in Workman's predicted success. As his season went on through 1909 and the spring of 1910, the costs were not carried over from one opera to the next. On the opening nights of each season, on the opening nights for each opera in that season, the press met some of these people for the first time. These were the main players for the Mountaineers. Workman himself played Pierre, the head of the customs house. Elsie Spain was his daughter, Clarice. Lawrence Ledge played Conrad, the tenor character of the opera. Australian baritone Claude Fleming was Fritz. Frank Perfit played Sergeant Frederico, there on the left, and Jessie Rose played Annette on the right. Oh, go ahead. Reginald Lawrence played Gustav. Kate Forrester was Miss Spinifex. Ruby Gray was Yvonne. And Mabel Burnage was Armandine. Now, several previously unknown actors played the other bit parts in the opera, and photos aren't known to exist for most of them. We know almost nothing about the production process leading up to the first night, save for what little Workman told the Era in September of 1909. His plan was to produce new operas, and if they were successful, touring companies would be sent out. He had already sold a number of seats for the first night by the middle of the month. Now, to understand why this played out in the way that it did, we must examine the story of the opera and critical response to its performance. The opera begins with a sedate overture featuring some yodeling effects from the orchestra, and then a full statement of the main theme of the opera, the legend of the Edelweiss, which makes many appearances throughout the score. The curtain rises on the marketplace of a quaint alpine village in the mid-1850s. It is market day, and the villagers go about their usual business. After a short chorus, we are introduced to the men of the customs house, who quite openly admit that they steal from the tourists while searching for contraband, and the village girls seem to condone this behavior.
Well, we're very glad to meet you, and with all good wishes greet you. Though your life is very drastic and immoral, so elastic that you greedily hold on to, and then you chance a light from an earring to a stocking, which you know is very shocking. Simple ones with glasses booty as a just reward of duty, and to prove that they may do, and with all good wishes greet you. Well, we're very glad to meet you, and with all good wishes greet you. Oh, man is very drastic and almost so elastic that you greedily hold on to, and if you chance to light from an earring to a stocking, which you know is very shocking. Simple ones with glasses booty as a just reward of duty, and to prove that they may do, and with all good wishes greet you.
Annette, the village coquette, oh, hey, that rhymed. Annette, the village coquette, comes from the inn to say that she's had no opportunity to discover any attachment to any particular customs house man. She is quickly met by Gustav, a tender-hearted official whose delicate conscience prevents him from committing even the tiniest of crimes or offenses. It wears on him terribly, and he is 30, but looks 50 and feels 100. Gustav is an unusual part in the opera. Despite being a major character in the story, his role is confined entirely to dialogue. Apart from a single line that was later added to the opera, he has nothing at all to sing, no solos or songs to himself, or even in ensembles, there's nothing to sing. It is more part for an actor that is more an actor than a singer of any ability. Annette reminds the villagers that today is Clarice's birthday, which sparks gossip about her flirtation with Conrad, a wealthy man from the city. Annette expresses her frustration with Fritz, the mountaineer who had been vying for Clarice's affection until Conrad arrived. Annette believes she deserves a lover of her own rather than keeping two men in suspense as Clarice does. At this point in the story, it seems likely that a song for Annette was added in a later version of the opera. Audiences and critics expressed a desire for more of Jessie Rose, which suggests that the interpolated song beginning, "Lots of lovers dally at the chalet in the valley," was placed at this moment. However, I have to point out that this song was not published in the vocal score, so we don't know for certain where it went and what else it was about. It wasn't sold as a standalone piece. Clarice enters, and the villagers wish her many happy returns of the day. Clarice, in return, invites them to her father's soiree later in the evening at the chalet. As the villagers go off, Armandine and Yvonne remain to tease Clarice about her relationship with Fritz and hope that he will join them for the party and the dance instead of running off to the mountains. Conrad is heard singing as he approaches.
Was it the sigh of a passing soul, or song of the whispering trees? Was it the noise of leafy boughs that sway to the evening breeze? Nay, for the music as sweeter than this speaks of a rapture to be. Whispers them down the sweet pathway of flowers, my darling, my love comes to me. Was it the sound of the distant stream that ripples away to the sea? Was it the dirge of dying day, or drown of a drowsy bee? Nay, for the music was sweet of my fall, the music of stream or of tree. 'Twas the voice of my dear one whispering low, tremblingly calling to me. Dear love, I'm here, I'm here, I'm waiting for thee, my
Conrad gives Clarice a birthday gift, a gold locket. She remarks that he speaks to her just as Fritz used to, and Conrad argues that he can love her 10,000 times more than Fritz. Clarice is less interested, and as they sing a lively duet, it's clear their relationship is one-sided, for they don't have quite the same views and tastes. And they agree to adjourn the matter to another day. Pierre congratulates his men on a job well done and encourages them to pilfer certain articles from the tourists who are due up the mountain by the diligence any minute. He views their thefts as donations and says that certain people traveling have to be reminded of their own general obnoxiousness.
There are people who, in traveling by some unhappy knack, contrive to be a nuisance and a bore. To share a carriage with them, but your nerves upon the rack, and you vow that you'll never travel more. But if I can seize a luggage by a lucky fortune's chance, I know which little duties to perform. And for these unpleasant people, I can tell them at a glance, I can try to make it very, very long. You can try to make it very, very long. There are wretched, stubby people who won't have the window down with the temperature of 90 in the shade. There are others who use nasty words and tell you with a frown that they always like to call a spade a spade. There are women who in carriages for swarming will contrive by some inherent cussedness to swarm. But for these and people pestering to know when they'll arrive, I can try to make it very, very wrong. You can try to make it very, very wrong. There are people who are lighting from the train will never fail to always leave the carriage door ajar. There are wretched little babies who emit a plaintive wail and will make you blush by calling you papa. There's a man who on your trousers never fails to wipe the boots without the faintest symptom of a qualm. But for these and for the man who smokes a relish of cheroot, I can try to make it very, very wrong. You can try to make it very, very wrong.
I'm going to go off script here for a sec. At this point, in the second version of the opera, Pierre gained an encore verse for his traveling song, and it ran like this. I promise I won't sing. It showed Pierre's ambitions to handle money and to gain more and more of it, and he views himself to be the exchequer of. His lyrics ran like this: "To be popular with all, I shall take a bit from Paul and pass it on to Peter, who has none. Though 'twill pall on Paul, no doubt, when his income peters out, I'll repeat appalling taxes till it's done. Yet, yes, I'll cram the taxes on, plus a duty when he's gone, till he can't afford to live, nor yet to die. All the dukes will emigrate to some less enlightened state when I manage the exchequer by and by." And the chorus responds with, "He's a robber and a wrecker, so he's made for the exchequer, that is bound to be his mecker by and by." It's funny, isn't it? All right, now back to the script. The diligence appears, bearing the tourists for the day, and the villagers turn out to observe them and pester them to buy souvenirs. The custom house men immediately begin to ransack the luggage, and Pierre is quickly addressed by Miss Spinifex, an Englishwoman on holiday. In the process of conversation and inspection, he discovers that she is a wealthy spinster, so he invites her to make a long stay with him in hopes of acquiring her heart, and in the process, her diamonds. When the crowd disperses, Fritz comes on the scene. He has heard the villagers chatter about Clarice and Conrad, but he doesn't intend to interfere with her happiness. Clarice plays him by saying he doesn't love her anymore. Fritz then begins to sing what is arguably the best song in the opera, a romantic ballad titled "Doubting," which always received an encore in performance and was so popular that it was later played in many of the silent movie houses of the 1910s. We have a video there somewhere. No, that's the wrong one. Try again.
When roses cease to yield their fragrance, when sunrise fails to light the sky, when mighty oceans stay their flowing, when flowers in springtime droop and
Fritz comes face to face with Conrad, and a quarrel for Clarice ensues, loud enough to draw Pierre from the inn and to scold them for distracting him from wooing Miss Spinifex. They then sing a quartet. Pierre begins with rapid patter music expressing his frustration, and then the others begin to sing in the tradition of grand opera, where they all express diverse viewpoints. Clarice laments that the lovely day is spoiled with the arguing. Conrad observes that the day of joy and ease are coming to an end, and Fritz expresses his irritation and jealousy. The passengers from the diligence are chased back on by the villagers, who are still urging them to buy their wares, and their attention shifts when Pierre announces that two men are asking for the hand of his daughter. Clarice does not decide. Instead, she reminds them of the local custom. No girl in the village has to listen to a man's suit until he presents her with an edelweiss from the highest peak of the mountain as a token of love. Clarice relates the tale in the opera's most famous song, The Legend of the Edelweiss.
I'll tell you of a maiden
Fritz and Conrad have now heard the challenge and plan to set out at once. But Pierre observes a storm approaching and begs them not to go, lest they both be lost on the mountain. Clarice agrees that they should not go, but forget this silly quest. But they won't hear of any delay, and Fritz, being the more experienced climber, gives Conrad a 6-hour head start. The ensemble sings a rousing march tune as the curtain falls in the first act. Act 2 opens with an entr'acte featuring a reprise of the Edelweiss theme in waltz time. When the curtain rises, the scene is set inside Pierre's chalet where his guests are dancing a mazurka. Pierre introduces Miss Spinifex to the group and invites them to take refreshments in the next room. Miss Spinifex shows a great interest in Gustav, who is thrilled to engage in some scandalous behavior. He flirts with her and escorts her to the next room. How wicked, yeah? Meanwhile, Pierre and Annette are furious, and they express their frustration by singing a duet about the violent fantasies they entertain in response to that situation. Left alone, Clarice regrets sending her men on such a dangerous mission. She removes Conrad's locket and places it on the chimney-piece. Just then, Fritz enters, disguised as an organ grinder seeking shelter from the storm. Clarice mistakes him for a mystic, and he offers to read her fortune. According to his reading, she loves 2 men, but secretly prefers the Mountaineer. Clarice declines to confirm his manipulative reading and decides to rejoin the party in the next room. Fritz discovers the locket on the chimney-piece, and Pierre catches him in the act, mistaking him for a thief. Fritz quickly abandons his disguise, leaving Pierre heartbroken by the revelation. At this point in the opera, the action comes to a screeching halt when Pierre begins to sing. An indirect reference to Silas Marner, Pierre's song is of a serious tone, but it adds nothing to the drama of the scene or the opera as a whole. It's coming, I promise.
Tis the hand of my son, was the old man's cry, as a thief in the night he has come ere I die, as a thief to his full returning. Ah, black the day, sighed the old man then, vain are the dreams in the lives of men. Sad is the story, hope dies away. Broken my heart at life's closing day. Ah, black a day, broken my heart at life's closing day.
Workman could sing serious music in a serious way, but critics unanimously declared that this song held up the story and was dramatically weak. We are wrenched back to the story when Pierre orders Fritz to return to the mountain and bring Conrad back alive because he would rather have a wealthy son-in-law. As Fritz begrudgingly departs, the guests reappear, having enjoyed their supper. Armandine spies out the window. A soldier is approaching the chalet, which sets the girls all aflutter.
But I'm sure the ladies here will say that I am quite a pleasant interruption of non-commissioned officers of blood and thunder vein. I'm foremost in the fighting as in Cupid's little game. All honestly I mention that my name's on every tongue when tales of love are whispered and the deeds are wonders sung. But what a soldier prizes more than any love vivant are just three simple phrases, and I'll not tell you what they are. A well-filled pipe, a well-filled bowl, a smile from the eyes of beauty. A man, if you please, just give them these. It's fit for a soldier's duty.
The soldier is Sergeant Frederico, and after introducing himself, he shows himself to be quite the ladies' man. But his visit has a purpose. There is a rumor of immediate war with the neighboring power, and he is hastening to the front. There will shortly be a calling up of the reserves. Pierre, of course, makes a scene and refuses to go to battle, but the sergeant tells him he is too old to fight. In the second version of the opera, a dueling scene was added, and we may assume it was added in this part of the story. Pierre challenged Gustave to a duel with pistols for the honor of Miss Spinifex. Supported by her and Annette, and pistols provided by the sergeant, the duel ended in a draw. Then they have a song about it, a delightful quintet, and no one had to die, and then there's a dance for some reason. The respective couples are restored to one another, and Annette has a scene with Gustave in which she describes the sort of husband she wants. It is time for everyone to go home, so the chorus comes back on and they sing a goodnight chorus. The press would remark that the song is pretty, but it could have done with some better writing for the inner voices. When everyone has gone, Clarice is left to mind the chalet alone. She admits to the silent snow that she loves Fritz and wishes he would come back soon. She's too anxious to sleep, so she sits before the fireplace. Clarice falls asleep before the fireplace, and at this point, the gauzes descend to begin a dream sequence. Critics would later say that it was trite but effective. Tremolo strings provide the music on the Edelweiss theme as the scene commences. It shows a spot high in the mountains. There is a shrine before which a red light burns, and Conrad lies insensible in the snow. Fritz comes across him, scorns him, and prepares to pass him by and leave him there. But the shrine arrests his attention. He struggles with his better feelings and finally rescues Conrad and carries him back down the mountain. The dream abruptly ends, and Clarice wakes with a start, wondering if what she saw was real. Yodeling calls are heard without, and Clarice wonders if something has happened. And then the chorus begins to sing. It's not clear what the chorus does in the Act 2 finale. If they remain off stage, they have a great deal of singing for the entire finale through the scenery, and business on stage becomes limited in its options. But if they come on stage, they're in their bedclothes, and why are they on stage for any dramatic reason at all? Can anyone explain that? Pierre comes downstairs, and Clarice asks what has happened. He tells her that Conrad is safe and sound upstairs in bed, and suggests that Clarice go to bed as well. But what of Fritz? He enters through the front door, and after the chorus hails him a hero with the march theme from the end of the first act, Clarice goes to him and begs forgiveness. But Fritz won't hear of it. He didn't bring back the Edelweiss, but he brought back Conrad, who he believes she loves best. Having lost his chance at a wealthy son-in-law, Pierre has a few choice words for her, echoing his patter from the quartet of the first act. He has served you rightly, madam, and you'll see upon reflection that you can't play ducks and dracuses with any man's affection. If you think that you can keep him whilst you're ogling with another, you're mistaken, as I frequently impressed upon your mother. Never mind, you still have Conrad, and if you should chance to get a wealthy husband such as he is, it would suit your daddy better. Here's the present that he gave you. Bless my heart, you needn't think it, that you'll keep the rich one either, if you can't preserve his trinket. He returns the locket to her, and she flings it away in disgust. Fritz is overcome with emotion as Clarice falls at his feet, and the chorus wraps up the finale with a stirring chorus. Act 3 opens with another entr'acte, possibly marking the only time in a Savoy opera in which two entr'actes are performed. This time it's a complete quotation of the Doubting theme. The curtain rises, and the scene is the same as the first act, the Alpine village marketplace, but with decorations for a wedding. A few weeks have passed since the second act concluded. The villagers are looking forward to the wedding of Fritz and Clarice, but Pierre is not. He is disgusted that Conrad, in gratitude for the saving of his life on the mountain, resigned the hand of Clarice. The village girls coax Pierre to make a move on Miss Spinifex, for a union with her would make him feel young and frivolous again. Annette has received a letter from Sergeant Frederico, and she uses it to make Gustav jealous. She suggests that he marry someone he does not like. It would be almost a criminal action on his part, but as an immoral act, it would be magnificent. Gustav admits that he doesn't particularly like Annette, and she implores him to marry her before he grows to love her again. Annette opens the letter and reads that war has been declared. She should expect the sergeant this very day. Gustav warns her not to flirt with the sergeant, and she reminds him of his little escapade with Miss Spinifex a few weeks back. To her, he's like a ship blown this way and that with every breath of wind.
By night and by day the poor maid struggled hard and pursued her with that way and this. But she quickly would fly with a laugh in her eye when he touched her white stem with a kiss. Then the wind from the west looked sorely depressed, and he said in a petulant tone,
Pierre shoots his shot with Miss Spinifex and asks her to marry him. She wants to be wooed in the custom of the country, but he is already prepared for that. Get this. He produces a huge paper edelweiss, which he claims to have acquired that morning between his early glass of goat's milk and breakfast. He spins a story about his adventure, and she absolutely gushes over his bravery. And then they dance about it. They do that a lot of dancing in this opera, can you tell? She accepts the fake flower and runs off to get ready for the wedding at once. Conrad is despondent and wonders if he will ever forget his love for Clarice.
Is the love dead that once within a longing flooded my soul and swept all else aside? As the joy fled, the password visions thronging, is life a scroll of hopes that lived and died? No, 'tis not dead, for touch of hers would waken all that has been in days long passed away. No, 'tis not fled, for though now forsaken, she was my queen and will be so forever. She was my queen and will be so
The wedding party comes on and sings a bridal chorus as they cross the scene to the church. Pierre escorts Clarice, and as the chorus exits into the church, Miss Spinifex runs in behind them in her bridal finery. As soon as they are all gone, a small complement of soldiers marches in, led by Sergeant Frederico. Only one man in the village has been summoned for active duty, and of course, it's Fritz. Conrad is horrified to learn this news and tries to bribe the sergeant into forgetting Fritz, but the sergeant won't hear of it. The wedding party returns, and here I must pause to point out a long-standing error in the vocal scores I find really funny. In both editions, the first line should be, "Now the deed is done," but instead it reads, "Now the deer is done." Are they eating venison for this wedding reception? The sergeant delivers the unhappy news, causing Clarice to faint. It wasn't just that spelling error, you know. Pierre attempts to give the sergeant an earful, but when asked if he would like to take Fritz's place, Pierre quickly zips his lip. Fritz prepares to say goodbye to Clarice, and although she begs to go with him, this cannot be. Conrad saves the day by offering to take Fritz's place in the marching line. The sergeant has no problem with this, and Conrad is given a gun and takes his place in the ranks as the finale of the opera commences. This was the opera that Workman selected to open his season at the Savoy. The event was heavily publicized, and the opera opened to a full house on the 29th of September 1909. By all accounts, the performance went splendidly, but something was off. The audience wasn't entirely buying it. There was something picturesqueness about it. But it did not have that spark. What made the evening a success was workmen and the continuation of the Savoy traditions. The opera itself came in third when it should have been first. The press almost unanimously declared it far ahead of contemporary musical offerings around London, but in the same reviews also said that it wasn't stimulating, that it was sober, that it lacked relevant satire. Now, this does not mean it was dull or not worth going to see. On the contrary, the opera provided a very pleasant evening's entertainment. It was a good story and well told. The presentation of the opera was definitely a spectacle, which had always been a feature at the Savoy, and the performances from the actors were all top-notch. Somerville's happiest writing was in his strings, and the music was considered to be good music, although one critic went so far to say that the music was more suited to the concert hall than the theater, and they had different audiences in those days. Eden's libretto was refined and agreeable, and the lyrics have a good natural flow to them, but it lacked distinction in several places. The tessitura of Clarice was considered to be needlessly high, but they enjoyed Elsie Spain's singing anyway. And there wasn't enough of Jessie Rose in the opera. As for the story itself, charming and sweet, a lovely homage to the Jenner, but some felt it could benefit from a little more excitement and fun. Eden and Somerville responded quickly to critics by making significant improvements to their work. Enter Arthur Wimperis. Next slide. Wimperis was an English dramatist who found success in writing Edwardian musical comedies, his most successful stage work being The Arcadians, which also premiered in 1909. Later on, he wrote screenplays and found even bigger success with MGM. For the Mountaineers, he was called in to brighten up the opera and place the emphasis on comedy and write a few new songs for it. In our modern parlance, the opera became a rom-com with music. Now for the additions. Annette got a new song, as I previously mentioned, and Pierre's traveling song, which I mentioned. Lost my place, give me a sec. Also, the aforementioned dueling scene in Act 2, and in Act 3, Clarice gained a new waltz song beginning, "The breezes sing low mid the roses." Critics would later deem this her best song, but noted it was quite conventional and offered little innovation. Out went Pierre's largely irrelevant ballad, and his song from the third act took its place, which gave the chorus a reason to be on stage at that point, but its inclusion, its movement, now unbalanced the drama of the scene. The lengthy introduction to the diligence chorus of the first act was shortened. The yodeling chorus inexplicably disappeared, and some minor alterations were made to the Act 2 finale. One curious alteration was the renaming of Fritz to Jean, which has no apparent dramatic justification. If there were improvements in dialogue, it is not clear. The press reports frustratingly give no clues as to dialogue improvements, and I never found a libretto reflecting these changes. The evidence of two distinctly different vocal scores suggests that it was all done in a great hurry, with many obvious errors appearing in both scores and libretto alike. Curiously, Pierre's irrelevant song was published separately from the opera, and it was marketed explicitly as part of the Mountaineers. This new version was already in play by the 12th of October. In later performances, the press remarked on how much better it was performing. The cast were doing everything they could to make it fun, and one critic implied that this led to overacting. Regrettably, the changes made the opera less unified. It now tottered awkwardly between opera and musical comedy without achieving the best of either. It tried to be the opposite of musical comedy while being exactly that. Despite all that, audiences continued to show up for it, and as far as anyone else knew, the opera was expected to have a healthy run. The libretto for the long-anticipated Fallen Fairies was read to the cast on November 8th, during the ongoing run of Mountaineers. This timing highlights the strategic planning behind the productions at the Savoy, as Mountaineers had always been intended as a short-term offering to pave the way for the new opera. It had a relatively brief run, concluding on November 27th after only 61 performances. This modest number has led some to label the Mountaineers a failure, but it is important to remember that it was never intended to sustain the entire season, just open it. Fallen Fairies opened 2 weeks later to a full house and an enthusiastic audience. However, this positive reception was not matched by critical acclaim. Critics quickly expressed the opinion that the collaboration of Gilbert and German did not measure up to Gilbert and Sullivan. They pointed to Gilbert's outdated libretto and German's less than stellar musical composition as the main factors, and it just did not fulfill the high expectations. It did not match the hype. It did not spark joy. Financially, the opera struggled to secure a lasting audience, which was reflected in its box office receipts. Historian Brian Rees documented that over its brief run, the production earned only a couple £100, indicating a significant financial shortfall. Other factors contributed to the lack of attendance, including audience disinterest, the Christmas season, and dissatisfaction with the work itself. Now, the controversy surrounding Fallen Fairies, all of that is not the focus of this. It's an entirely different story. Whole hot mess there. It lies outside Mountaineers, so we'll come back to that maybe at a later date. We might, I don't know. Fallen Fairies lasted barely 6 weeks before being withdrawn after 51 performances. No one would see it on the stage again until 2003. What makes this doubly unfortunate is that Fallen Fairies was considered to be a big deal and more prestigious than its predecessor. Eden and Somerville made attempts to improve their creation and appeal to public tastes. Gilbert and German did not, and their work quickly lapsed into obscurity. The unexpectedly short run must have caused investor panic and great stress for Workman, and to finish his year, he sublet the Savoy to Austin Hergen for a spring production of the musical Two Merry Monarchs. This opera featured almost none of the known Savoyards, largely because it was Hergen's company which occupied the theater that spring, and despite a lavish production, it too died after only 43 performances. It was transferred to the Strand Theatre for a week before it went to tour in the provinces in the summer of 1910. A second tour was given in 1911, and upon its conclusion, Two Merry Monarchs drifted off to sleep eternal. It has not been seen since. Because of the whole debacle of Fallen Fairies, Gilbert forbade Workman to produce or appear in any of his operas in London. And without the repertoire of Gilbert and Sullivan to keep the Savoy Theatre open, and declining success with each new production, Workman threw in the towel. He did not renew his lease on the Savoy. He returned to performing in the colonies and died at sea in 1923. Most of the actors involved in Workman's scheme don't appear to have done much after it. Elsie Spain participated in The Chocolate Soldier alongside Workman later in 1910. Jesse Rose and Frank Perfeet and Reginald Lawrence all disappear from the historical record. But conversely, Claude Fleming had a Hollywood film career in the 1920s and 30s. Most of the others have since become untraceable. Meanwhile, the Mountaineers have been packed up for its own tours. While Two Merry Monarchs went on at the Savoy, the Mountaineers played in the provinces during that spring under management of Harry P. Towers. It featured Savoyards Leo Sheffield as Sergeant Frederico and Aida Genoir as Miss Spinifex. Marie Dainton was Clarice, and Claude Fleming reprised his role as Fritz, or Jean. Press reports from this tour mostly indicate that the opera was well received and appreciated and popular. There was also a later tour in the autumn, and performances on the continent in Barcelona at Teatro Nuevo and later Madrid, and then translated to French for premieres in both Paris and Belgium. I don't know where in Belgium. The opera entered the amateur circuit first in 1911 with Derby Opera Company. If there were others prior to the war years, I didn't find any record of them. In 1924, the opera's second version received broadcasts with dialogue on the BBC on the 24th of March and the 26th of June. Both performances were conducted by Stanton Jeffries, and they featured some of the same cast between them. Regrettably, neither performance was preserved on record for later rebroadcasting because this was not common practice at the time. As the 1920s continued, the opera received occasional performances by amateur societies, but they had become less frequent by 1930. The publisher, Ascherberg, Hopwood and Crew, was sold, and all of the performing material, the rentable performing material for the opera vanished from sight. As far as we know, the performance of the opera in North America did not occur until the 21st century. The Mountaineers was completely abandoned by the 1940s, and as the 20th century went on, only specialists really knew anything concrete about it. Reginald Somerville died in 1948, and Guy Eden in 1954. I started studying Savoy opera after the Mikado, and it wasn't until 2004 that I had first heard of the Mountaineers. None of the books available to me ever mentioned it. But when I acquired the record set, The Art of the Savoyard, the opera began to reveal itself. Gramophone artist George Baker had a few tracks in the record in which he shared his recollections of famous Savoyards who also made records in the gramophone era. He spoke of workmen who he last saw in Fallen Fairies, and Baker knew that to be a failure. And there was another opera in front of that called The Mountaineers, and Baker didn't think that was an enormous success either. This little anecdote, this one anecdote right here, triggered a need in me to find out more about this opera, but I couldn't act on it for a few years. Included in this album is a song performed by Claude Fleming, but the song is from the musical A Southern Maid. Thus, the Mountaineers eluded its discoverers. In all my years of research, I have never found any gramophone recording of any selections from the Mountaineers, despite the contemporary popularity of Doubting and Legend of the Edelweiss, and a published arrangement of selections for military band. It's possible the opera simply didn't make it to record. When Wikipedia began to get several pages on the Savoy operas, no entry was planned for the Mountaineers. There simply wasn't anything to say on the subject. I hoped to fill in the blanks. In 2008, I got the idea to dig up the old opera and publish my findings in a book. And the following year, this book became a reality in the final Savoy operas, which is a study of Workman's season of light opera. A second edition was published in 2010 and backed by a successful production of the opera that year with my opera company. The vocal score was given a complete new edition in 2013 with all the music from both versions of the opera and all of the opera's dialogue. Working on this opera has been a passion of mine for many years, and it would bring me joy to learn of another modern performance of the opera. The Mountaineers is a hidden gem that deserves greater attention. Although it didn't run as long as some other shows, it has a unique story and good music, and deserves a second look by a new generation. Perhaps one that is not comparing everything that alongside it appears to be compared with Gilbert and Sullivan. Sorry, I started over that one. Can I try that again? Can I do a take two? Workman's hasty substitution led many to overlook this opera, but that shouldn't overshadow its quality. It stands up against some of the Savoy operas of the 1890s, showing its own creativity and merit. As we seek fresh stories today, The Mountaineers offers a bright experience that captures the spirit of its day. For those interested in discovering forgotten works, The Mountaineers is worth exploring. Even short-lived shows can have heart and significance. It is past time to hear Clarice recount the legend of the Edelweiss and urge her suitors to seek out that chilly little flower once again. I'd like to open the floor for questions if there are any, a brief Q&A period. Let me get the microphone. Is it on? All right. Wow. I'll come right to you. Come right to you.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about Fallen Fairies. We did some songs from that, right?
We did not. No, we did not. I probably talked about it at some point, but no, we didn't do anything from that.
Can you tell us a little bit more about Fallen Fairies?
Sure. She wants to know what Fallen Fairies is about. Boy, that's a whole nutshell right there. And given the size of it, it may as well be chosen a chestnut. There are fairies who live on the upper side of a cloud. They look down on the wicked world below. They're aware of all the strife and all the problems down here on Earth. And the one thing that keeps them from ending their own species is love. And fairies, of course, cannot experience love themselves. So they do a ritual, and they summon two mortal men from Earth to come to fairyland so that they may experience love for themselves. Unfortunately, it backfires because the fairy queen falls in love with one of the men, but he doesn't particularly like her very much. There's jealousy, there's strife, there's theft, there's lying, there's bloodshed, and lots of drama. It goes from being a lighthearted comedy to some serious drama and a curious mixture that Gilbert never tried before at the Savoy Theatre. And he thought it was a good idea, but it was like the gnashings of teeth. Imagine putting an active Othello into the Merry Wives of Windsor. Give that some thought. It was like that kind of blend. It just did not work, and the audience was not liking it. And there's a whole lot of backstage drama that went along with the opera that caused it to be tanked within 6 weeks. It wasn't just played out front, it was also played in the newspapers. And there was a legal battle between German and Workman and Gilbert and Nancy McIntosh, and the big mess. This is why I would do it on a separate lecture, and I didn't want to talk about it in this one. Anyone else got a question? I see one back here. I saw you first. Let me get there. I promise we'll come back to you.
I was wondering about your research. Did you have to go to archives to research? This is before Google?
Actually, yes. But I managed to do nearly all the research on this opera without ever leaving home back in 2008 and 2009. I had good connections with friends online who also studied Gilbert and Sullivan opera. And one of them just happened to be at the British Library at the time all this started, so he was able to print off many things for me and forward them to me. And I found bits of information scattered all around. And so it was my idea it was my task really to put them all together, because they were all in diverse sources everywhere, but nothing really connected. And this is why no one really knew anything. All the information was broken up. You had a question?
So what is the difference between light opera and what we might consider, yeah.
Wow, that's a whole discussion in itself. Light opera tends to be lighter fare. I think we may be thinking of grand opera, perhaps. What most people know about grand opera comes from Bugs Bunny. And and heavy singing, heavy music, lots of big costumes, stories about, well, it depends on the language you're performing. German opera tends to be with gods and mythology. Italian has those lambent shades of light and darkness. French does gaudy tinsely tunes. It varies. Lighter opera tends to be closer to our 20th century musicals, but with more substance, I think. But also some of the things that were contemporary with Mountaineers tended to be a bunch of songs lumped together and ticketed comic opera when it really wasn't. It was paper-thin plot in which they strung dialogue and musical numbers and dancing and not much else. And Mountaineers gave us more substance than that. That's the best I could do in short. I think that'd be a discussion to have later. Anyone else? Yes. Goodness, so many questions. I didn't expect this.
Can you tell us a bit about the history of recording the clips that you shared with us today? And for example, like if you fully produced it in 2010, what led you to re-record some bits of it this year? And are you planning to do any more? Or is this finally complete?
Which question shall I answer first? I selected that work in 2010 because that was the 100th anniversary of the final Savoy operas. As you may observe, Two Merry Monarchs premiered in 1910, so I chose a century later for its 100th anniversary. And I couldn't do Two Merry Monarchs by itself. I just didn't have the right thing for it. Didn't have the right setting for it. But I wanted to do Mountaineers as well, so we put those things together. That was that. And I recorded it then, and I've been picking away at it ever since. I recorded things elsewhere. Might do more if there's enough interest, but hopefully this lecture itself generates some interest. Was that all the questions? Did I skip one? Okay, anybody else? One more.
Did you perform the Mountaineers in costume, or did it look like that?
It looked like that. We hadn't the budget for the costume at the time, and besides, it was a concert version of the opera, and I didn't want to get into doing costuming. With only 8 singers at the time, I kind of couldn't justify doing costuming, especially since there were some cast doublings at that point in the company. Did you have a question?
Yeah. Basically, with
the different, or the added songs, like, have you performed it enough times where you would have like a fan edit where some of the new ones or some of the old ones you prefer, or like versus like the original casting where it was the older songs and then the other songs came in? Would you?
I'm not sure I understand.
They add new pieces, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are there some that you think should be excluded, or like you said that they dropped off the yodeling song? Would you arrange it differently if you were to do the play from start to finish?
Absolutely. Absolutely. When I republished the vocal score in 2013, I put everything I could get together into that book. With the intention that all of it should be there. It was put there by the authors for a reason, and considering it's a yodeling chorus that doesn't really happen anywhere else in Savoy opera, so why was it dropped? No one knows. At least no one who wrote it down can tell us why they did that. Well, I would definitely keep. I would definitely try to keep as much in there as possible. Cut when necessary. It really depends upon the cast you have, and as making cuts beforehand assumes a perfect cast, and sometimes that just doesn't come off like that. Sometimes it just doesn't happen that way. Were there any more questions? Okay, I think that's the end. There's some thanks to give at the end. Give me a sec. Those of you watching this online, thank you for tuning in. I hope this helps you understand the importance of this opera and why it should be accepted as part of the larger Savoy canon. Before we close, acknowledgements, boring church announcements. I need to acknowledge Reverend Sarah Casey and Tibbetts UMC for hosting this event, the volunteers operating the AV for this event, the broadcast, members of Rockford Operetta Party, Shirley Lindberg, John Limitone, Cara Pravarsky, Betsy Wharton, Patricia Jeske, Mary Jo Armstrong, David Stone, Ian Bond, Michael Beert, the late Clifton Coles, Jeffrey Dixon, and Karen Meadows, members of Savoynet, the Mandarin Mitchinson Collection, University of Bristol Theatre Collection, Patrick Shannon, Mr. Crozon of Toronto, and so many others I can't remember. If I failed to name you, please accept my apologies and know that your assistance has been valuable to me. If you enjoyed this lecture, please give it a big thumbs up and leave comments. For those of you present, thank you for attending my lecture.